Hello everyone and welcome today. We're going to be talking about bonds. Now what exactly are bonds? Well, bonds are just instruments. They're loans. They're basically a loan. And what it does is you're looking at it from the point of view of you being the lender, and you buy a bond from an organization, a company, a government, something like that. Bonds normally have a price attached to them. It's called a face value. It's called the face value. And this face value is normally about $1,000. So it's normally to see a bond with a face value of $1,000. Now the interesting thing with bonds is that they're really good investments, in the sense that you are loaning a company $1,000 or multiples of $1,000, and they in turn will pay you interest on that. Now the interesting thing with the bond is what happens is they will pay you interest semi-annually, in other words twice a year, and at the end of the period, and there is a set period on a bond that lasts for a certain time, they will pay you your $1,000 back. So essentially, what you're doing is you're loaning them $1,000. They're paying rent on that money semi-annually, and it's called interest. And at the end of the period for which you've rented it, they'll pay you $1,000 back. So that's essentially how a bond works. It's a loan to a company or a government agency that, instead of paying back in proportions like we've seen traditional loans do, what they do is they just borrow the money and they pay rent on the money, and at the end of the term they pay the money back. So let's take a look at why we're looking at this here in this particular course. Well, the fact of the matter is that bonds, when they're sold on a given day, and they will have something called a coupon rate. And the coupon rate is like, well, let's just say it's the stated rate of interest that they will pay. So let's assume that it's 10%, just for lack of a better terminology. So that means half a year's time, they will pay 10% of $1,000. They'll pay you $100 in interest. And then in a full year, they'll pay you another $100 in interest, and so on. This will go on for as long, and at the end of it, they'll pay you $1,000. But you know, if it were that simple, it's pretty straightforward. It's not an overly difficult proposition, is it? But the fact of the matter is, we get tired of things and we sell things, or these things are what are called marketable. So essentially, you can, somewhere between the start and the finish of a bond, you can sell it. The question then becomes is, how much is it worth? What is the value of that bond at any point along the way of its life? Now, you would think then that, well, you know, is it worth more than $1,000? Well, it probably is, seeing it has money-making potential. And it would certainly be dependent on what the market rate of interest is. If you thought about the market rate of interest, now, this amount right here that's on the bond is called a coupon rate. In other words, that's what the bond pays. But let's assume the market rate of interest is 20%. The question I would ask you is, if you had a choice between putting your money in something that would earn you 10% rate of interest, or putting your money in something that's worth 20% rate of interest, what would you do? Well, the rational person would normally put it in the higher rated instrument. So, you know, if you're trying to sell this bond halfway through, like here, and it's only paying 10%, someone's going to say, oh, why would I buy that from you when I can earn 20% in the market? So essentially, what you're going to have to do is sell this bond for less than $1,000. So in other words, you'll sell it at what's called a discount. In other words, it would effectively, and the discount amount will be effectively the difference between the rate of interest that's being paid on this bond and the rate of interest you can get in the market. the opposite could be true as well, where, for example, the market rate out there is, let's say, 5%. So in other words, your bond is paying 10%. The market rate, what normal people can get out in the market, if you go to the bank or whatever, you'll get 5%. Suddenly, your bond is going to become a lot more attractive. It pays 10%, whereas the market only pays 5%. So in other words, this is a more valuable option. Now, if you tried to sell it, is it worth $1,000 or is it worth more than $1,000? In that particular instance, where the bond pays a higher interest, the price of the bond will go up. So you'll be able to sell that bond for more than $1,000, which will equate to, the idea of the market rate being 5%. The bond pays twice that. Someone's going to be interested in paying a lot more for that bond. So what we're looking at in this particular unit then, in this particular section of the unit, is valuing bonds. We're going to look at value of bonds. And it relates to the purpose, it relates to the issue of when we actually sell the bond. Okay? So that's essentially what we're looking at here. Now, so how can we value a bond? Well, let's take a look at it. The value of the bond, well, if the bond starts here, let's assume that this is the bond, and it's $1,000, and let's assume this is year 0, 1, 2, 3, and then it's due year 4. So essentially, and let's assume again that it pays 10% rate. So essentially, this particular bond will pay $100 in year 1, $100 in year 2, $100 in year 3, $100 in interest in year 4, plus the $1,000 back because you're cashing in your bond. So we should be able to kind of figure this out then of how much the bond is worth. Let's just arbitrarily say, here, how much is the bond worth here? So if we're looking at the price of the bond right here, we need to be able to come back and say, how much future income will it earn? Let's value that. And let's get it at its present value. And then we also have to say, how much is the present value of that $1,000 lump sum? So actually, when we look at pricing a bond, the bond price then is really made up of, well, the interest, and that is, for lack of the example, $100, times how many times that interest is paid, so the value, the present value of the interest payments. Okay, so that's one thing. Plus the present value of the future value of the bond. And in this particular case, it's $1,000. So what we need to be able to do is calculate the present value of that end payment. So essentially, when we talk about discovering the bond price at any given point along here, what we have to do is we have to figure out what is the present value of the total interest payments and what is the present value of the final payment. Couple those two together, and that will give us the equivalent bond price for now. So the best way to see how bond valuation works is to actually do an example. So I'll get a simple example here. We got let's assume we buy a bond, and the bond costs $1,000. Most bonds cost $1,000. It's a 10-year bond, meaning that we're going to have it for 10 years. The plan is to have it for 10 years, and at the end of the 10 years, we get $1,000 back, and we'll pay interest for 10 years. The coupon rate is 7%. So I'm going to draw my little bond here. Looks like a little sales sticker. A coupon rate on it, 7%. They call it a coupon because it used to be like a little coupon that you pull off. So it's 7%, meaning that every 6 months, that bond will pay 7% annually, which is 3.5%. So we take, for example, the interest or the amount of interest that the bond will pay, we'll call it B, equals 7% divided by 2. The reason it's divided by 2 is it's a semi-annual payment. Bonds are always semi-annual. So 3.5%. So essentially, 3.5% of 1,000 will be paid every 6 months, which is $35. So that bond will generate an income of $35 every 6 months. So that's how that works. So now here it is now. Let's say that 5 years into the bond we sell it. Okay, so 5 years we're into it. So what's it worth? Okay. In order to be able to assess what it's worth, we got to know what the prevailing interest rate is. In other words, the market rate. The market rate, let's assume for our purposes, is 6%. So here we've got a bond that's paying 7%. The market rate is 6%, meaning that the bond is probably, going to be a more desirable investment than going to the bank and putting your money in there. So that's going to drive the price of the bond up. We're going to see this dollar figure. If we're going to sell it, we could get more for it because it's paying a higher rate of interest. But let's figure out how much we actually could get for it. Well, first of all, we have to think about the formula. The bond price, when we sell it, is made up of two major components: the present value of the interest payments plus the present value of the future value of the bond. Now, the future value of the bond is $1,000. Remember that at the end of the bond period, we get paid that $1,000 back. So essentially, this is the formula we're going to use. Now, in order to calculate the present value of interest payments, that's an annuity. So the present value of an annuity is the formula we've learned a little while back. The present value of an annuity is the payment 1 minus 1 plus I to the minus n over I. So again, going back to our old section of the course, the previous section of the course, this is this right here. Now the payment in this case, we know the payment. The payment is how much the bond pays. So we've calculated up here that this $1,000 bond, it's earning 7%, which is 3.5% semi-annually. So we know that that bond will pay $35 every 6 months. So the payment is $35. 1 minus 1 plus I. Now the interest rate on this is the prevailing interest rate. What's the market interest rate? So it's, and again, that has to be cut in half because the payment is semi-annual. So 0.06 divided by 2, we'll call that. And the number of payments, which is the minus n, the number of payments, well, we got 5 years times 2 payments a year equals 10. So n equals minus 10 in this case because it's a minus n. And that is over I, which is 0.06 divided by 2. Now, we can do the math on that section so far, and this will come to 298.56. Okay, that's part one. That's that side, the present value of the interest payments. But we also need to think about the present value of the future bond. Now, in order to calculate the present value of future payment, we've learned that PV equals the future value 1 plus I to the n, or to the minus n, I should say. So we know that this is the present value of future value of the bond. So what we're doing is calculating the present value of that $1,000. So it's 5 years. So here we are. Now let's take a look at it. Well, the future value, we know we're going to get $1,000 at the end of this. $1,000 will come in the van. 1 plus I, and 0.06 divided by 2, to the minus, and again it's n minus 10. Now if we do the math on that, that will come out to 744.09. So the bond then is worth the combination of the bond price is, the bond price then is 298.56 plus 744.09, which is 1,042.65. In other words, what we're saying is that if we sold that bond 5 years in, it's a 10-year bond, we're selling it 5 years in, and now the coupon rate is higher than the market rate, someone should be willing to pay us at that time that we're going to sell it $1,042.65. So that's how you do those types of problems in terms of bond valuation. Next we'll do a few examples.